They shoved $100 bill into my hand and told me to get a taxi. My own father in front of my sister's future in-laws, treating me like a beggar at my own sister's engagement party. "Don't embarrass us further, Cassia," my mother whispered, her eyes cold. The worst part wasn't the pity money or being kicked out. It was the look on my sister Brianna's face, smug, triumphant. She had finally proven to everyone that I was the family failure she always said I was. Have you ever been made to feel so small that you almost disappear? That night I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't just find my footing. I would build an empire so vast that one day they would be living in my world, and they wouldn't even know it until it was too late. The air in the Sterling family's country club was thick with the scent of money, lilies, and quiet judgment. I'm Cassia Vance, and that night I was a ghost haunting my own sister's engagement party. Everything about the room was designed to make me feel small. The ceilings soared 2 stories high, and massive crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, casting a light so brilliant and unforgiving that it seemed to highlight every flaw. My dress, a simple navy sheath, had felt sophisticated in the half-light of my tiny apartment. Here, it looked like a drab uniform. It clung to me, a silent testament to the fact that I didn't belong. My sister, Brianna, was the star of this universe. She didn't walk, she glided, her designer gown shimmering with every movement. Her hand was permanently attached to her fiancé, Landon Sterling, a man who looked like he was born wearing a tuxedo. They were a perfect couple, sculpted from privilege and ambition. My father, Richard Vance, was in his element. He stood beside Mr. George Sterling, the patriarch of an old money empire, and he was trying way too hard. His laughter was a booming, unnatural sound that echoed slightly in the vast room. He was a self-made man, a fact he never let anyone forget, and he wore his success like a suit of armor. But around men like Mr. Sterling, you could see the chinks in it. You could see the desperate need for approval, the insecurity of new money trying to pass as old. My mother, Corinne, trailed behind him, her smile plastered on her face. Her job tonight was social gatekeeper, and her primary target was me. Every few minutes her eyes would find mine across the room, and she'd give me a subtle, sharp glare. It was a look I knew well. It meant, don't speak unless spoken to, don't draw attention, don't exist too loudly. My mere presence was a social liability she had to manage. The humiliation began as a series of small paper cuts. My mother introduced me to one of her friends with a dismissive wave of her hand. "And this is my other daughter, Cassia. She's the artistic one." The friend gave me a pitying smile, the kind you give to a child who has just shown you a macaroni necklace, before turning her attention back to Brianna's 4-carat diamond ring. A little later, Brianna gathered a circle of her perfectly manicured friends, and spotting me lingering nearby, called out, "Oh, Cassia, still finding yourself after dropping out of business school. Any luck?" Her friends giggled, a sound like tiny sharp bells. I felt my cheeks burn. I hadn't just dropped out, I had left because I couldn't stomach the thought of becoming my father, of seeing people as numbers on a spreadsheet. But that nuance was lost here. Here, it was a simple, damning story. I had failed. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, stood near the edge of that circle. She was a kind woman, but a broken one. After a messy divorce, she had become financially dependent on my father, and it had cost her her spine. She saw Brianna's jab, she saw the flush in my cheeks, and she quickly looked down at her glass of champagne, her shoulders slumping. Her silence was a betrayal, but I understood it. She couldn't afford to defend me. She was just as trapped in this gilded cage as I was. The real catalyst, the moment the paper cuts turned into a gaping wound, came when Mr. Sterling approached me. He had a quiet dignity my father lacked. His eyes were intelligent and observant. He was the jury. "Landon has told me you're a designer, Cassia," he said, his voice a pleasant, low baritone. "What is it you do exactly?" For a second I felt a flicker of hope, a real question, a chance to be seen. I opened my mouth to explain my freelance work, designing user interfaces and experiences for small businesses, making technology more human. But before I could get a single word out, my father's arm clamped down on my shoulder. "She's between things, George," he boomed, his voice full of false bonhomie. "A bit of a dreamer, Arcasia. We're helping her out, of course, making sure she has a roof over her head. He said it with a magnanimous smile, painting himself as the generous patriarch supporting his wayward, useless daughter. Mr. Sterling's expression didn't change, but his eyes held mine for a fraction of a second too long. There was no judgment in them, just observation. He was filing away the data, and the data was not in my favor. The final blow came an hour later. I had made the mistake of engaging in a pleasant conversation with one of Landon's cousins about a new art exhibit. Brianna saw it from across the room. She marched over, her face a mask of fury, and grabbed my arm, digging her nails into my skin. She pulled me toward an alcove, hidden behind a large floral arrangement. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Everyone here is somebody. They have careers. They have influence. You're just a broke failure. You look pathetic in that cheap dress, and you are embarrassing me on the most important night of my life." Her words hit me like stones. I stood there, speechless, the shame so thick I could barely breathe. Then my father appeared behind her, his face dark. He had overheard. He didn't defend me. He didn't correct her. He validated her. "She's right, Cassia," he said, his voice clipped and cold. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and extracted a crisp new $100 bill. In plain view of several guests who were now glancing over, curious about the commotion, he shoved it into my hand. "Go home, take a cab, we'll talk about your allowance later." The $100 bill was flimsy and powerful all at once. It wasn't money, it was a verdict. It was a dismissal. "You are not one of us. You are a charity case." I looked past his furious face, past Brianna's triumphant smirk. My eyes found Mr. and Mrs. Sterling. They were standing near the bar, watching the entire exchange. Their faces were perfectly, horribly unreadable. They were my jury, and the verdict was in. Guilty of being a nobody. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the money back in his face. A strange, cold calm settled over me. I simply closed my fingers around the crumpled bill, turned, and walked away. I walked out of the ballroom, through the opulent lobby, and out into the cool night air, the laughter and music fading behind me. The bill was a hot coal burning in my palm. The walk of shame from the country club felt like it stretched for an eternity. I didn't take a cab. The thought of using that $100 bill felt like swallowing poison. So I walked. The manicured lawns of the wealthy suburbs gave way to the cracked sidewalks and streetlights of the city. Each step was a tiny rebellion, a way to reclaim some piece of myself from the wreckage of the evening. The anger that had been a hot, boiling thing in my chest slowly cooled as I walked, mile after mile, until it solidified into something else, a cold, hard resolve. When I finally reached my apartment building, the lobby smelled of old takeout and disinfectant, a world away from the lilies and perfume of the party. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my door, my legs aching, my mind strangely clear. Inside, I switched on the single lamp in my living room, illuminating a space that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a holding cell. I smoothed out the crumpled $100 bill and placed it on my small, wobbly kitchen counter. It sat there under the weak light, a monument to my humiliation. My life, at that moment, was a perfect cliché of the struggling artist. My tiny apartment had drafty windows that rattled when the wind blew. My diet consisted mainly of instant noodles and whatever was on sale at the corner store. Piled on my desk was a mountain of mail, most of it threatening letters about the student loan debt I had accrued for the business degree I never finished. I was, by every metric my family valued, a complete and utter failure. For a full week, I let myself wallow in it. I unplugged my phone, ignoring the inevitable condescending texts from my mother about my behavior and the gloating passive-aggressive messages I knew would come from Brianna. I sat in the semi-darkness of my apartment, letting the shame wash over me. I replayed every conversation, every pitying glance, every dismissive wave. I let my father's voice echo in my head. Failure, dreamer, useless. I questioned every decision that had led me to this point. Dropping out of business school, pursuing a passion that paid pennies, alienating myself from the world of success my family worshipped. For a few days I almost believed them. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a loser, destined to be the family charity case forever. I was at the absolute bottom, scraping the barrel of my self-worth. Then, one night, unable to sleep, I did the only productive thing I could think of. I plugged my phone back in and started scrolling through a freelance job board, a desperate attempt to find some small project that could cover next month's rent. I clicked through dozens of postings, my eyes glazing over. Then I started to see it. Not in one post, but in the aggregate. A pattern. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, of small to medium-sized logistics and shipping companies, trucking businesses, regional distributors, small-scale warehouses, and they all had the same problem. They were desperate for software help, but their existing systems were a nightmare. They were using programs that looked like they were designed in 1995, ugly, complicated, and utterly unintuitive. The big tech companies were ignoring them, focused on flashier clients. The small freelancers were offering cookie-cutter websites. No one was serving this specific, unglamorous niche, making complex, ugly essential business software simple, elegant, and easy for anyone to use. A spark ignited in the darkness of my mind. It was small at first, then it grew brighter. I remembered a single lecture from my 1 year in business school. A guest professor, a woman who had built her company from nothing, had told us, "Everyone tells you to build a better mousetrap. That's a fool's game. The real money is in finding the people who are still using their bare hands to catch mice and selling them the very first trap." That was it. This was my corner of the world. These companies weren't glamorous, they weren't sexy, but they were the backbone of the economy, and they were being completely ignored by the design world. I felt a surge of energy, a feeling I hadn't had in years. The shame and anger from the party hadn't disappeared, but now they had a purpose. They were fuel. I stood up and walked over to my laptop. My hands were shaking, but with excitement, not fear. I used the last $50 in my savings account, not for groceries, but to buy a domain name. I called it Etheria Solutions. It sounded grand, established, powerful. It sounded like everything I wasn't, but it was a start. Right then, Etheria Solutions was nothing more than me, my beat-up old laptop, and a desperate idea born from spite and a diet of instant ramen. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like enough. The first few months of Etheria Solutions were a brutal education in humility and exhaustion. My life became a monotonous cycle of work, cheap coffee, and a few hours of fitful sleep. I was operating out of my tiny apartment, which now doubled as a corporate headquarters. The line between my living room and my office blurred until it disappeared completely. I started by building a portfolio from scratch. I couldn't afford to be proud. I reached out to tiny one-man operations I found on obscure forums, offering to redesign their login screens or inventory forms for next to nothing, sometimes just for a good review. It was grueling, thankless work. I spent hours staring at poorly designed interfaces, trying to untangle a decade of digital spaghetti code. But with each small project I learned something new. I learned the language of logistics. I learned the frustrations of the dispatchers, the warehouse managers, the truck drivers. They weren't just users, they were people whose jobs were being made harder by bad design. I worked 18-hour days, my back aching from my rickety chair, my eyes burning from staring at the screen. The city outside my window would go dark, then light up again, and I would barely notice. I survived on caffeine and the small thrill of solving a problem no one else wanted to touch. Finally, after weeks of this, I landed my first real, paying client. It was a small regional trucking company called Haul Right, run by a gruff, middle-aged man named Dave. He was deeply skeptical. "All you tech people are the same," he grumbled over the phone. "You promise the world, charge a fortune, and leave us with something that doesn't even work." I promised him I was different. I told him I wouldn't charge him a dime until he was satisfied. He was desperate enough to agree. I spent a solid week immersing myself in his company's operations. I didn't just look at his software. I talked to his dispatchers. I learned their pain points, the clumsy workarounds they had to invent just to do their jobs. Then I went back to my apartment and coded for 72 hours straight. I overhauled their entire dispatching interface, replacing a cluttered, confusing mess of buttons and text fields with a clean, intuitive visual map. It was the best work I had ever done. When I presented it to Dave, he was quiet for a long time. He just clicked around, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he looked up at me and grunted. Huh. Not bad. For me, that was a standing ovation. It was a small victory, but it was mine. It was real. I felt a flicker of pride so intense it almost brought tears to my eyes. And then, disaster struck. It was a Tuesday morning, their busiest time. My phone rang. It was Dave, and he was screaming. Not just angry, he was apoplectic. Your system, it's crashed. Everything is down. I have 20 trucks sitting idle because of you. My blood ran cold. A bug. It had to be a bug in my code. I tried to calm him down, to get details, but he just kept yelling. He threatened to sue me into oblivion, to call every other trucking company in the state and tell them I was a fraud. He wanted to ruin my non-existent reputation. As he screamed, a familiar voice echoed in the back of my mind. My father's voice, dripping with contempt. Failure. You can't even get this right. You're completely useless. For a terrifying moment, I believed him. The pride I had felt just days before evaporated, replaced by a wave of crushing self-doubt. I almost hung up the phone and curled into a ball. But then, the anger kicked in, the same cold resolve I'd felt after the engagement party. I would not let this break me. I would not prove my father right. I will fix it, I said, my voice shaking but firm. I will fix it, and I will stay on the phone with you until it is done. I spent the next 48 hours in a living nightmare. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I lived on coffee and sheer adrenaline. I found the bug, a single stupid typo in a line of code, a misplaced semicolon. It was such a small mistake, but it had caused a catastrophic failure. I fixed it. But I didn't stop there. I spent the next 24 hours building in redundancies, creating fail-safes, and stress testing the entire system to make sure it could never happen again. I didn't just patch the hole, I rebuilt the entire wall, stronger than before. When I was finally done, I called Dave back. I didn't make excuses. I owned my mistake completely. I walked him through the fix, showed him the new fail-safes I had implemented, and then I told him I was waiving my entire fee. He was still angry, but the screaming had stopped. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The new system, he said, his voice grudging. The dispatchers are saying it's faster, easier to use. He hung up without another word. I collapsed back into my chair, exhausted but alive. The lesson was brutal, but it was vital. Failure wasn't the end. It wasn't a verdict on my worth. It was just a very expensive, very stressful part of the process. It was the tuition I had to pay to learn my trade. Etheria Solutions was alive, but it was on life support. I had a handful of small clients like Dave, companies who were grudgingly satisfied with my work, but I was living invoice to invoice. The money I made was just enough to cover my rent and bills, with nothing left over. I was trapped in a cycle of small jobs, unable to scale up, to get a real foothold in the industry, to hire my first employee, to move out of my cramped apartment. I needed capital, a real investment, so I started researching. I spent my nights digging through websites for grants, angel investors, and startup competitions. I found a local tech grant specifically for innovative startups, aimed at underserved markets. It was perfect. It was my shot. I poured everything I had into the proposal. I spent a week polishing every word, creating mock-ups, and building a business plan that was probably more optimistic than realistic. But it was solid. It was based on the real problems I had seen, and the real solutions I had built. The day of the final interview, my hands were sweating so badly I had to wipe them on my pants before shaking hands. I was in a sterile, glass-walled boardroom that felt like an operating theater. I was on the table, and the panel of 3 judges were the surgeons, ready to cut me open. 2 of them were exactly what I expected. A venture capitalist with a slick suit and a bored expression, and a woman from a corporate innovation department who kept checking her email under the table. They asked predictable questions about my profit margins and 5-year projections. Their eyes glazed over when I tried to explain the importance of user-centric design in the logistics space. They saw a small-time freelancer with no track record, and they had already dismissed me. But the third man was different. He was older, with a tired look in his eyes, but an unnerving intensity in his gaze. His name was Arthur Pendleton. He didn't ask about my finances. He asked about my process. "Tell me about the bug with the trucking company," he said, his voice quiet but commanding. The other two panelists shifted uncomfortably. I took a deep breath and told him everything. The mistake, the screaming client, the 48 hours of hell, and how I rebuilt the system. He listened, nodding slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. He asked about my conversations with the dispatchers. He asked why I chose a specific color palette for an inventory screen. He wasn't asking the questions of an investor, he was asking the questions of an engineer, a builder. He was interested in the how and the why, not just the how much. After the other two panelists gave their polite but firm no, thanking me for my time and showing me the door, Arthur asked me to stay. He waited until they were gone, then gestured for me to sit back down. The room was silent for a moment. "My name," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of memory, "is Arthur Pendleton. For 30 years I was the CEO of Pendleton Logistics." The name hit me like a ton of bricks. Pendleton Logistics hadn't just been a company, it had been an institution, a giant in the industry. And then, about 5 years ago, it had imploded, going bankrupt in a shockingly short amount of time. "My company went under," he continued, his gaze distant, "because we had the market cornered, and I was too proud and too stupid to listen. I had young people, just like you, coming to me, telling me our technology was a dinosaur, that we needed to adapt or we would die. I ignored them. I thought I knew better." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine again. The weariness was gone, replaced by a fire I hadn't seen before. "When you talked about listening to those dispatchers, when you explained how you fixed that bug, I didn't just see a good pitch. I saw the person I should have listened to all those years ago. I saw the future that I was too blind to see." He took a deep breath. "The grant committee is a waste of time. They're looking for the next social media app. They don't understand what you're doing, but I do." He made me an offer that left me speechless. He wasn't going to give me the grant. He was going to give me a personal investment, a significant one, enough to hire a team, to rent a real office, to finally scale. In exchange, he wanted a 10% stake in Etheria Solutions and a position as my advisor. He wanted me to be his mentee. "Don't misunderstand me," he said, his expression grim. "This isn't charity. My motive is entirely selfish. I want to see my ideas, the ones I was too late to implement, proven right. I want to see you build what I failed to protect. I don't want my story to be your story." In that sterile boardroom, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I found more than just a check. I found an ally. Arthur Pendleton's mentorship was a baptism by fire. He was nothing like the encouraging, gentle mentor you see in movies. He was gruff, demanding, and brutally honest. He ripped my initial business plan to shreds, not because it was bad, but because it was timid. "You're thinking like a freelancer, Cassia," he'd grumble, stabbing a finger at my projections. "You're asking for permission to succeed. Stop asking, start taking." His first order of business was to get me out of my apartment. He rented a small, unmarked office for me in a nondescript building on the industrial side of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was professional. It had a door I could close, a desk that didn't wobble, and a coffee machine that worked. It was a space where Etheria Solutions could become a real company, not just a desperate hustle. He taught me the language of the world my father inhabited, the language of CEOs and investors. He made me practice my pitch until my voice was raw, forcing me to distill my passion for user design into cold, hard metrics: increased efficiency, reduced training time, higher employee retention. "They don't care about beauty," he'd say. "They care about the bottom line. Show them how your beauty makes them money." He opened up his old Rolodex, connecting me not with the CEOs, but with the disgruntled mid-level logistics managers he'd known for decades. These were the men and women on the front lines, the ones who, like Arthur, felt left behind by the pace of technology. They were my secret weapon. They trusted Arthur, and through him, they gave me a chance. We didn't go after the big, flashy corporations. Arthur's strategy was to conquer the middle. The Fortune 500 companies are too slow, too bureaucratic, he explained. The tiny companies can't afford you. The sweet spot is the medium-sized players. The family-owned empires big enough to have real problems and real money, but small enough to make a decision without a dozen board meetings. And it worked. We started landing contracts, good ones. I hired my first employee, then a second. We were a small, scrappy team, building a reputation in the shadows of the industry. All of this happened in complete secrecy. To my family, I was still just Cassia, the struggling artist. I let them believe I was still doing minor freelance work from my apartment to make ends meet. It was a crucial part of the plan. Their low expectations were my greatest asset. My mother would call occasionally, her voice dripping with pity. "Are you eating enough, dear? Your father and I could send you some money if you're having trouble." I'd play the part, telling her I was getting by, while in the background, my team was celebrating a new six-figure contract. The deception felt strange but necessary. It was my shield. One afternoon, Brianna called. It was a few months before her wedding, and she was in the throes of planning. The call wasn't a genuine check-in. It was a performance. She spent 20 minutes detailing the ridiculously expensive floral arrangements she had chosen, the celebrity chef they had hired for the catering, and the five-star resort in Bali where they would be honeymooning. Each detail was a carefully aimed dart, designed to highlight the chasm between our lives. "The centerpieces alone cost more than your rent for a year, I bet," she laughed. A cruel, thoughtless sound. I just sat there in my quiet office, looking at a whiteboard covered in complex software architecture diagrams. "Wow, Brianna," I murmured, playing my part perfectly. "That sounds amazing. I'm so happy for you." As she prattled on about color swatches, I was silently approving a wire transfer to a new server farm. The secrecy was my armor. No one was watching. No one was expecting anything from me. While Brianna was building a life based on appearances, I was quietly, methodically, building an empire based on substance. Etheria Solutions was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. We had a steady stream of clients, a growing team of brilliant engineers, and we were profitable. The quiet momentum we were building started to make small waves in the tech industry. We were becoming known as the go-to firm for revitalizing legacy systems in the logistics space. Then an email landed in my inbox that had the power to change everything overnight. It was from a senior vice president at a massive tech conglomerate, one of the sharks of the industry. They were famous for their ruthless acquire and gut strategy. They'd buy promising young companies, absorb their technology and client lists, and then lay off most of the original team. The email was direct and to the point. They had been watching us. They were impressed, and they wanted to buy Etheria Solutions. The number they offered was staggering. It was a life-changing amount of money, the kind of sum that solves every problem you've ever had, and a few you didn't even know existed. It was enough to never have to work another day in my life. It was a clear, undeniable sign that I had made it. The temptation was a physical force, a weight pressing down on me. I immediately pictured the ultimate revenge fantasy, walking up to my father's oversized mansion, not with a crumpled $100 bill, but with a cashier's check for an amount that would eclipse his entire net worth. I could see the look on his face, the shock, the confusion, the forced respect. I could buy his approval, the one thing he had always withheld. I could finally win the game he had forced me to play. The thought was intoxicating. I spent a whole day agonizing over it, running the numbers, imagining the freedom. But something felt wrong. It felt too easy, too hollow. I finally called Arthur and told him about the offer. He was quiet for a long time after I read him the email. I expected him to be thrilled, to congratulate me on the victory. Instead, he asked me one simple, devastating question. "What was the point of all this, Cassia? Did you go through all that hell just to get rich, or did you do it to build something that lasts?" His question cut through all the noise, all the fantasies of revenge. I thought back to the beginning. I thought about Dave, my first client, and the terror of the system crash. I remembered the intense, visceral satisfaction of not just fixing the bug, but making his employees' lives genuinely easier. I thought about the team I had built, the 3 brilliant, dedicated engineers who believed in my vision and had taken a risk on a small, unknown company. This conglomerate wouldn't care about any of that. They would see my clients as entries in a database, my employees as lines on a spreadsheet. They would take my carefully crafted solutions, strip them for parts, and discard the rest. They would destroy the very soul of what I had built. The revenge fantasy suddenly seemed pathetic and small. What was the point of showing my father I was successful if in the process I became just like him, someone who valued money above people, above purpose? I realized that true victory wasn't about proving him wrong, it was about proving myself right. I called Arthur back. "I'm turning it down," I said, and for the first time since the offer arrived, I felt a sense of peace. That night, I didn't fantasize about revenge. Instead, I went to my lawyer's office and signed the paperwork to create an employee stock ownership plan. I gave my first 3 employees, the ones who had been with me through the hardest times, a real, meaningful equity stake in the company we were building together. My integrity wasn't for sale. My legacy wasn't for sale. This choice solidified everything for me. I wasn't just building a company to get back at my family. I was building a different kind of world, one with different rules, and I was just getting started. The problem with secrets is that they rarely stay secret forever. As Etheria grew, it became harder to hide. We weren't just a tiny startup anymore. We were a recognized name in our niche. And eventually, a small piece of that success trickled back to my family. It happened, as these things often do, through my Aunt Carol. During a weekly family dinner she was obligated to attend, she let it slip to my mother that my little computer thing seemed to be doing okay. She mentioned, trying to be helpful, that she'd heard I had even hired a few people. To Aunt Carol, it was a piece of good news, a small point of pride. To my mother, it was intel, and she delivered that intel directly to my father, Richard. His reaction was not what you might expect. There was no pride, no flicker of paternal satisfaction. To my father, my success, however minor he imagined it to be, was not a victory to be celebrated. It was an act of defiance. I was the designated failure. My role in the family narrative was to be the person they could feel sorry for, the one who proved how successful and generous they were. By achieving even a sliver of independence, I was upsetting the established order. I was challenging his authority, and he couldn't stand it. At the time, Etheria was on the cusp of our biggest contract yet. It was with a mid-sized distribution company called Logicorp, run by a man named Frank Miller. The deal was significant enough to double our revenue and firmly establish us as the dominant player in our market. It was the culmination of months of hard work. The final meeting was just a formality. Unbeknownst to me, Frank Miller was a longtime associate of my father's. They belonged to the same golf club. Their wives were in the same charity league. When my mother mentioned my name and my little company to Frank's wife, the connection was made. My father made a phone call. He didn't yell or threaten. He was far more insidious than that. He framed his sabotage as fatherly concern. He told Frank Miller that he was worried about me, that I was in over my head. He painted me as unreliable, inexperienced, and emotionally volatile. He told Frank that my company was a risky bet, built on a shaky foundation, and that he, as Frank's friend, couldn't in good conscience let him sign a deal that was bound to fail. He made it sound like he was protecting his friend from his own incompetent daughter. The deal collapsed overnight. I received a short, blunt email the next morning. "Dear Ms. Vance, after further consideration, we've decided to go in a more established direction. We wish you the best." No explanation, no apology, just a door slammed shut in my face. It was a devastating personal blow. Arthur and I knew immediately what had happened. There was no other explanation. The sudden reversal, the cold corporate language, it had my father's fingerprints all over it. My own father had actively, deliberately sabotaged my success. For a day, all the progress I had made felt like an illusion. The old feeling of worthlessness came rushing back, a toxic wave that left me gasping for air. He could still hurt me. From miles away with a single phone call, he could still make me feel like that pathetic little girl being kicked out of the engagement party. He could still make me a failure. I went to Arthur's office, my hands shaking with rage and despair. I paced back and forth, ranting, crying, letting out all the poison. He just sat behind his desk, watching me, letting the storm break. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes. He just let me feel the full weight of the betrayal. When I finally collapsed into a chair, exhausted and empty, he leaned forward. His eyes were hard as steel. "Good," he said, his voice a low growl. "Now you know, the enemy isn't some abstract concept. It's not the market, it's him, and he is real, and he is ruthless." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "You've been playing defense this whole time, Cassia. You've been trying to prove you're worthy. Stop, that game is rigged." He turned back to face me, and a grim smile touched his lips. He just declared war. It's time to stop playing defense. It's time to go on the attack. The sabotage wasn't a setback, it was a declaration of war. My father's attack had been personal, designed to put me back in my box. It did the opposite, it unshackled me. The anger from that betrayal didn't just burn, it refined itself into pure, cold jet fuel. Arthur saw the change in me. The hurt was still there, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard resolve. "He thinks he cut you off at the knees," Arthur said in our next strategy session. "He thinks you're just a little one-woman shop he can snuff out with a phone call. He has no idea what you're really capable of." We tore up our old business plan. The goal was no longer slow, organic growth. It was time for a new strategy. Aggressive, silent acquisition. My father and his cronies operated in a world of handshakes and golf course deals. They understood tangible assets, factories, trucks, warehouses. They didn't understand the invisible world of software, code, and intellectual property. That was their blind spot, and it was about to become my greatest advantage. With Arthur's deep knowledge of the industry and the capital we had quietly accumulated, we started hunting. We weren't looking for healthy companies. We were looking for struggling tech firms with brilliant engineers, but terrible management. Companies that were rich in talent, but poor in vision, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. These were companies my father and his network had never even heard of. They were ghosts on the balance sheets of the old guard. Our first acquisition was a small firm called Dataflow, a team of 3 genius coders who had built an incredible data analytics engine, but had no idea how to sell it. They were 2 months from shutting down. We didn't just buy them, we absorbed them. I offered them generous salaries and, more importantly, a vision. I showed them how their engine could be the brain for the intuitive user interfaces we were building. They were ecstatic. They didn't want to be entrepreneurs. They wanted to solve hard problems. I gave them a whole new playground. We repeated the process twice more over the next 6 months. We acquired a company that specialized in mobile logistics apps, and another that had developed a cutting-edge routing algorithm. Crucially, we didn't merge these companies under the Etheria name. That was Arthur's masterstroke. We allowed them to continue operating as independent entities with their own names and websites. On the surface, they were just 3 separate, small tech firms. But behind the scenes, I was the sole owner. I integrated my user-centric design philosophy and Etheria's core technology into their products, transforming them from struggling ventures into highly effective, specialized tools. On paper, I was still just the CEO of Etheria Solutions, a modest but successful software company. In reality, I now controlled a silent, interconnected network of specialized tech solutions. My company was no longer a single entity, it was an ecosystem. We were becoming indispensable to the logistics industry, and almost no one knew that all these innovative new tools were secretly flowing from a single source. The final piece of the puzzle fell into my lap. Sterling and Sons Logistics, the company owned by my sister's future in-laws, was in trouble. They were an old guard giant, exactly the kind of company Arthur's had been before its fall. They were powerful and respected, but their internal technology was a creaking ancient relic. They were bleeding efficiency and losing clients to more nimble competitors. They were desperately trying to modernize, and they had heard whispers about the innovative new power in the sector, Etheria Solutions. Mr. Sterling's office began reaching out, trying to land a meeting with our mysterious press-shy CEO. They sent polite emails, they left polite voicemails, and following Arthur's advice, I ignored every single one of them. For months, I let them wait. I let their desperation build. The power dynamic was shifting, and they didn't even know who they were dealing with. They were chasing a ghost, completely unaware that the ghost was the same girl their future daughter-in-law had called a broke failure. A thick, cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment one Tuesday evening. The paper was heavy, expensive, with embossed lettering. It felt less like mail, and more like a royal decree. It was, of course, Brianna's wedding invitation. The event was to be held at a 5-star hotel ballroom, the kind of place where a single dinner plate costs more than my monthly grocery bill. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a summons. A command performance for my final public shaming. Tucked inside, on a separate smaller card, was a handwritten note from my mother. Her cursive was perfect, each loop and swirl a testament to a lifetime of practicing propriety. The words themselves, however, were an exercise in casual cruelty. Cassia, it read, "We've gone ahead and placed you at a table with your cousins. Please make an effort to look presentable. We don't want any repeat of the engagement party." A year ago, that note would have shattered me. It would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and self-loathing. But now, as I stood in my quiet apartment, a different feeling washed over me. The rage was there, but it wasn't hot and messy. It was cold, clean, and perfectly focused. There was no panic, no fear, just a profound, chilling sense of clarity. I wasn't the same person who had been kicked out of that engagement party. That Cassia was gone. In her place was a woman who controlled a silent tech empire, a woman who held the future of Sterling and Sons logistics in the palm of her hand. They thought they were inviting the family failure to witness their triumph. They had no idea they were inviting their judge. I picked up my phone and called Arthur. I read him the note from my mother, my voice flat and even. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then he let out a short, sharp laugh. "Presentable?" he chuckled, the sound rumbling through the phone. "Oh my dear, you're not just going to be presentable, you are going to be the main event, and they don't even know the show is for them." His voice sobered, but the amusement was still there, like a current running beneath the surface. "Listen to me, Cassia. When you walk into that room, they will see the girl they have always tried to make you, the failure, the charity case. Don't fight it, let them see what they want to see. But you," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more intense, "you will remember who you are. You are not the girl they kicked out. You are the woman who owns the key to their future. You hold all the cards. Walk into that room, and remember." I looked at the invitation in my hand, at the looping, elegant script spelling out my name. I took a deep breath. "I'll be there," I said. I opened my laptop and sent a single-word reply to the wedding RSVP email. Yes. I arrived at the Grand Imperial Hotel ballroom, precisely on time. Not early, not late, just on time. The air hummed with the sound of a string quartet and the low murmur of 100 conversations. The room was a fantasy of white roses and gold accents. My family was gathered near the entrance, greeting guests. My father was expansive, shaking hands with a proprietary air. My mother was a vision of social grace, her smile never faltering. And Brianna, in her magnificent wedding gown, was radiant, the undisputed queen of the evening. Then they saw me, and for a moment, the perfectly constructed facade faltered. There was a collective pause, a flicker of confusion in their eyes. They were expecting the broke, artistic failure. They were expecting the girl in the cheap dress. I wasn't that girl anymore. I was wearing a custom-tailored suit, the fabric a deep, elegant charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the light around it. The cut was sharp, modern, and severe. It wasn't a dress designed to be pretty, it was an outfit designed to be respected. It didn't scream wealth, it whispered power. My hair was pulled back in a sleek, severe style, and my makeup was minimal. I looked like I belonged on the cover of Forbes, not at a table in the back next to the kitchens. For a second, they were stunned into silence. I had deviated from the script, and it threw them off. Brianna was the first to recover. The confusion on her face hardened into her familiar mask of condescending pity. She glided over, her perfect smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Cassia, you made it," she said, her voice a little too loud. "You look nice. Your table is over there." She pointed vaguely toward a remote corner of the vast ballroom, a table tucked away near the speakers and a service entrance. It was social Siberia, the table for unwanted relatives and obligatory invites. The message was clear. "You may have a new suit, but you still don't belong here." I didn't rise to the bait. I just smiled, a small, calm smile. "Congratulations, Brianna. You look beautiful." My composure seemed to unnerve her more than any argument ever could. I wasn't playing my part. I wasn't looking wounded or resentful. I was just calm. I made my way to my designated table, nodding politely to my cousins, who gave me awkward, sympathetic looks. I took my seat, a silent observer in a suit of armor. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the head table, and I saw something interesting. Mr. Sterling, the calm, dignified patriarch, looked anxious. He was constantly, discreetly checking his phone. I watched as he pulled my father aside, their heads close together in a hushed, stressed conversation. Even over the music, I could catch bits and pieces. "Can't get a confirmation. This Etheria CEO is supposed to be here tonight. The deal is crucial for us, Richard." My father, puffing out his chest, clapped Mr. Sterling on the shoulder. "Don't you worry, George," I heard him say, his voice full of blustering confidence. "People like that, the real power players, they're drawn to people like us. This wedding is the biggest event of the season. They'll show. We'll make it happen." They were so sure of their world, so confident in the gravity of their own importance. They had built this glittering palace of social status and expected all the other planets to revolve around it. They had no idea that a new sun had just entered their solar system and that they were living in my world now. The moment arrived, as I knew it would, just after the main course plates were cleared away. The band was taking a break, and a relative lull had fallen over the ballroom. Mr. Sterling was looking more anxious than ever, his gaze darting toward the ballroom entrance. My father was trying to look nonchalant, but the tightness around his jaw betrayed his own nervousness. Brianna, meanwhile, was basking in the glow of her perfect wedding, blissfully unaware of the corporate drama unfolding at her own head table. Then I saw her, a sharp young woman in a dark business suit, holding a tablet, moving with purpose through the crowd. She was Mr. Sterling's assistant. She made a beeline for the head table, leaning down to speak to him. "Sir," she said, her voice low but crisp enough to be audible in the relative quiet. "I have confirmation. The CEO of Etheria Solutions is here. They have agreed to a 5-minute introductory meeting." A wave of relief and excitement washed over the head table. My father beamed, a triumphant, "I told you so" look on his face. He was already taking credit for this social coup. Brianna looked ecstatic. Landing a meeting with this mysterious CEO at her wedding would be the ultimate status symbol, the crowning achievement of her perfectly orchestrated evening. "Excellent," Mr. Sterling commanded, his anxiety vanishing, replaced by executive authority. "Where are they? Bring them over to the lounge immediately." The assistant consulted her tablet, her finger tracing down a list. Then she looked up, her eyes scanning the room. My family held their breath, expecting her to point to some distinguished-looking older man at a nearby table. The assistant began to walk. She walked past the head table, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She walked past the tables of my father's important business partners. She walked past the table of Landon's wealthy family friends. She walked with unwavering purpose, crossing the entire expanse of the ballroom, directly toward the forgotten table in the back corner, the one tucked away by the speakers. She stopped directly in front of me. "Ms. Vance?" she asked, her voice perfectly professional and clear, cutting through the low murmur of the room. A confused silence began to spread from our table outwards. My father, seeing the assistant stop at his family's table, started to stand up, a proud smile on his face. "There must be a mistake, my dear," he said, gesturing to himself. "I'm Richard Vance." Brianna, not to be outdone, chimed in from the head table, her voice ringing with bridal authority. "And I'm the bride, Brianna Sterling to be." The meeting is with us. The assistant didn't even glance at them. Her eyes, polite but firm, remained fixed on me. My instructions are for Cassia Vance, she stated, her voice unwavering, CEO of Etheria Solutions. Time stopped. It felt like a soundproof bubble had descended over the entire ballroom, sucking out all the air and noise. Every eye in the room was now locked on our table, on me. My father froze mid-motion, his mouth hanging slightly open, the proud smile melting from his face into a mask of utter bewilderment. I looked at Brianna. The color drained from her face, as if a plug had been pulled. The radiant bride became a pale, horrified statue, her eyes wide with a dawning, monstrous disbelief. My mother, sitting beside my father, brought a hand to her mouth, her face a crumpled mess of shock. And then, at the head table, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, the quiet, observant jury, both rose to their feet. Their expressions were a perfect, stunning portrait of pure, unadulterated shock. And in unison, their voices carrying across the silent, gaping room, they asked the single question that shattered my family's world into a million pieces. CEO? I stood up slowly, deliberately. I took a moment to smooth the front of my charcoal gray suit jacket, a small, calm gesture in the midst of the catastrophic silence. The entire room felt like it was holding its breath. I gave Mr. Sterling's assistant a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you for your patience," I said, my voice quiet but carrying easily in the stillness. Then I turned my gaze from the assistant to the head table. I looked directly at Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, who were still standing, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning incredible respect. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice as even and steady as a heartbeat, "it's a pleasure to finally meet you both in person. I believe we have a lot to discuss." Then, and only then, did I allow my eyes to drift to my family. The devastation was absolute. My father was a statue of broken pride. The blustering, confident man was gone, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed stranger. His worldview had been a simple one. He was the sun, and his family were planets held in his orbit by the gravity of his money and power. In a single sentence, that universe had collapsed. I looked at my mother. She was staring at me as if I were a complete stranger, her face etched with a terror that went beyond mere shock. It was the terror of someone who realizes they have fundamentally misjudged the reality of their own life. And Brianna, my beautiful, triumphant sister, her perfect wedding was in ruins around her, not because of a misplaced flower or a drunken groomsman, but because of me. Her face was a canvas of raw, unfiltered horror. In her eyes, I saw the dawning realization that the family failure she had mocked and pitied for years was now, incomprehensibly, the most powerful person in the room. I didn't say a word to them. I didn't need to. I didn't gloat. I didn't sneer. I didn't say "I told you so." My silence was my statement. My calm was my revenge. The simple act of me standing there in my power suit, being addressed as CEO, was a judgment more damning than any insult I could have hurled. I turned my back on them. The entire room watched as I walked with the Sterlings and their assistant toward a private lounge off the main ballroom. I could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes on my back, could feel the frantic, whispered conversations erupting in my wake. As I walked, I caught the eye of my Aunt Carol. She was still sitting at the pariah table, but she was no longer slumped in defeat. Tears were streaming down her face, but for the first time in as long as I could remember, she was smiling. It was a watery, trembling, but genuinely proud smile. In her eyes, I saw a reflection of my own liberation. My victory wasn't a loud, screaming match. It was a quiet, undeniable public shift of power. It had exposed my family for the shallow, insecure tyrants they truly were. Their cruelty, their judgment of me. It was never about my worth. It was always a desperate, frantic defense against their own deep-seated fears. And in that one, silent, shattering moment, they had become the nobodies. I had just bought the company of their dreams, and they hadn't even known my name. The final scene of my story doesn't take place in a grand ballroom or a sterile boardroom. It's a month after the wedding. I'm in a bright, airy workshop space, in a converted warehouse downtown. The walls are covered in whiteboards filled with scribbled diagrams and hopeful ideas. Sunlight streams through the large industrial windows. This is a non-profit incubator I've funded through Etheria's new philanthropic arm. It's a place for young people with unconventional ideas, the artists, the dreamers, the ones who don't fit into neat corporate boxes, to get the kind of support and mentorship I never had. Arthur is with me, sitting on a stool, looking more relaxed than I have ever seen him. The weight of his own past seems to have lifted. We're not talking about contracts or acquisitions. We're looking at a design for a community-owned solar power project, drawn up by a brilliant 20-year-old engineering student. My phone buzzes on the table beside me. I glance down. It's a long, rambling text message from Brianna. It's a messy soup of apologies, excuses, and desperate pleas to reconnect. Another message pops up. It's from my father. It's short and to the point. Cassia, we need to talk business, call me. A year ago, these messages would have been everything I ever wanted. They were admissions of my victory, proof of my power. Now they just feel sad. I read them, feel a brief, faint flicker of the past, like a phantom limb, and then I calmly tap the screen and delete them both without replying. My victory was never about forcing them to see my worth. It was about me realizing that I didn't need them to. True success wasn't the moment they found out I was a CEO. It was the moment I realized their opinion no longer mattered to me at all. I look around the workshop, at the hopeful faces of the young entrepreneurs, at the wild, chaotic energy of creation. I look at Arthur, who has finally found a way to turn his regrets into someone else's legacy, and I feel a profound sense of peace. I didn't just build a company to get back at them. In the end, I built a new family, a new future, one where value is measured not by a balance sheet, but by creativity, integrity, and kindness. I finally stopped trying to earn a seat at their table and decided to build my own. And here, surrounded by people who see the world the way I do, I am finally home. My story is proof that your worth is not determined by the labels people try to give you. It's determined by what you choose to build when no one is watching. What labels have you refused to accept in your own life? I'd love to read your stories, so let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, and you believe in the power of writing your own success story, hit that like button and subscribe for more true life narratives. Thanks for watching.